A pilot spotted a strange structure in the desert, but once he stepped inside, everything changed for him. Captain Mason Reed had flown over deserts before. Long stretches of dry land, broken only by rock or scrub, were common from the sky. This flight was supposed to be no different. The mission was simple, a routine aerial survey for a mapping project. His small crew joined him, each person assigned to monitor equipment, check readings, and mark locations of interest. The sky was clear. The heat outside was intense. Inside the cockpit, fans worked hard to keep the air moving. The plane's engines hummed as the landscape below rolled on, flat and empty. Hours passed with little to report. Just sand, more sand, and the occasional shadow of a dry hill. Then, something unusual caught Mason's eye. Out in the distance, a dark square shape broke the line of the dunes. It looked man-made. Not a rock, not a shadow, something solid. Mason leaned forward, checking the plane's instruments and maps. There was nothing marked in that area. No buildings, no stations, no ruins, just blank desert. He called out for the others to look. They confirmed it. A structure was sitting in the middle of nowhere, not listed anywhere on their navigation system. The shape became clearer as they flew closer. It had straight edges. The corners looked sharp. It wasn't recent, but it wasn't collapsed either. It stood alone in the middle of the sand, like it had been forgotten a long time ago. Mason circled once, trying to get a better view. The roof looked damaged. Part of it had caved in. The walls were faded, pale against the gold of the dunes. There were no signs of movement. No paths, no vehicles, no flags. The building just sat there, silent and still. Mason checked the fuel and altitude. They had time. They had supplies. He made a decision. He brought the plane lower. The crew said nothing, but he could feel their unease. No one liked surprises in the desert. But curiosity was stronger. Mason scanned the area for a place to land. The sand was flat near the structure. It would be rough, but safe enough. He adjusted the angle, reduced speed, and brought the plane down. The landing was bumpy but controlled. Dust rose around them. The heat hit hard the moment the engines powered down. The air outside shimmered. Waves of warmth came off the ground like smoke. Everyone grabbed gear and stepped out. Boots sank slightly into the hot sand. Mason shielded his eyes with one hand. The building stood about 200 meters away. The wind was light, just enough to move the edges of his shirt. The silence was deep. There were no birds, no insects, no signs of life. Only the wind and the heat. They walked in a line, their steps slow. The sand dragged at their feet. As they got closer, details came into view. Cracks ran across the outer walls. The windows had no glass, only empty frames. Part of the front door hung open, swinging slightly. Paint had peeled off long ago. The corners of the building were rounded by time and weather. It looked like it had been built for something important, but left to rot. Mason stopped a few feet from the entrance. He turned and looked behind them. The plane sat alone, its silver body shining in the sunlight. There were no other signs of humanity anywhere around them. The desert stretched in every direction, wide and empty. The horizon melted into the sky. He turned back to the building. The crew stood beside him. Sweat ran down their faces. No one spoke. The air felt heavy. Each person seemed to wait for someone else to move first. The sun burned above them, and still the building stayed quiet. A shadow fell across the entrance. Without a word, Mason stepped forward. His boots crunched softly over the sand as he crossed the last few steps to the entrance. The air around the building felt warmer, heavier. The rest of the crew followed behind him. No one said anything. The silence around them stayed thick and still. Only the faint wind moved, brushing dust along the side of the structure. They stopped just outside the doorway. The building was taller than it looked from the air. The sun lit up the front wall, showing faded paint and deep cracks running down the sides. Pieces of broken stucco had fallen off in chunks, leaving bare concrete underneath. The wooden frame around the door was crooked. One hinge was broken. The other barely held what was left of the door in place. The wood had splintered and rotted, like it had been through too many summers without care. Mason took a few steps to the left. He walked along the wall, checking the windows. The glass was long gone. Just empty frames remained, some bent or warped. Inside, only darkness waited. A few dried weeds had grown up through the sand near the base of the wall. There was no sound from within, no movement, no sign of life. The crew spread out. They circled the building slowly, checking perimeter. The walls were all in the same condition, dry, cracked, and covered in dust. At the back, there was a broken pipe sticking out from the wall. It was rusted and bent downward. It looked like it had once been part of a water system, but there was no water now. No tank, no well, just dry land in every direction. They looked for signs of how the building had been used. There were no paths, no footprints, no tracks, no fences or tools, no marks from vehicles. Nothing had touched the area in years. The sand around it was smooth, shaped only by wind. The dunes nearby rolled in soft, even waves. Each step they took left a new print on untouched ground. Mason paused near one of the corners. He looked out over the open desert. The landscape stretched without end. There were no landmarks, no trees, no animals, just the endless sand, pale under the sunlight. The building was the only sign that a human had ever been here. He moved back to the entrance. The others joined him. They stood there, watching the open doorway. A shadow stretched inside, reaching toward them across the sand. The roof above the door had partly collapsed, but the main structure still held. The shape of the house was simple. One level with a higher section in the middle, likely an upstairs room. No signs of electricity or communication lines. Nothing modern. They checked around the sides one more time, walking carefully through the sand. Still, they found nothing that told them why the building was here. It made no sense. Too far from roads. No water. No support. Just built and forgotten. Or built and hidden. Back at the entrance, Mason stood still. The air had grown warmer. Sweat dripped down his back. His shirt clung to him. He glanced at the others. Their faces were tight. Eyes narrowed. The heat was bad, but something else made it worse. Something quiet in the air. Like the building didn't want them to be there. Still, they were here now. They had come this far. It was time to go inside. Mason stepped through the doorway, and the others followed behind him. The air inside was still and dry. The sunlight coming through the broken windows made soft patterns on the floor. Dust floated in the air. Everything was silent. The house smelled of heat, dry wood, and old things that had not been touched for years. The floor was covered in a thin layer of sand that had blown in through the windows and open door. Each step they took left a trail behind them. The walls were cracked and faded. Some parts of the plaster had fallen off, leaving the wooden beams exposed. A few nails stuck out here and there, rusted and bent. In the center of the main room stood a small table. One of its legs had broken, so it leaned to the side. On top of it sat a photo frame. The glass was dirty and cracked, but the picture underneath was still clear enough to see. It showed a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the same house. They were smiling, but the background was just sand. No cars, no trees, just the house and the dunes. The photo had faded from sunlight and time, but it had not been moved. Near the photo was a chair with one arm missing. The cushion was torn, the inside stuffing spilling out like dried cotton. A fan sat in the corner, rusted and still. Its cord trailed along the floor, covered in dust. No signs of electricity could be seen. The outlets on the wall were empty. The wires had been pulled loose or cut. The sand in the room had strange patterns. It looked like it had once been swept into a corner, but the wind had brought it back again. Small footprints, maybe from an animal, ran across one edge. No big animals, though, just light marks. Hard to see unless someone looked closely. They moved into the next room. The door was missing, but the frame was still in place. Inside, the light was dimmer. One of the windows had been boarded up from the inside, but the boards had cracked and fallen halfway. The floor here had more sand. It had piled against one wall, like a small dune. In the center of the room sat a large trunk. It was made of dark wood, with metal edges and leather straps. The leather had dried and split in places. The metal was dull and scratched. One of the straps had broken, but the other was still fastened. They opened the trunk slowly. Inside were stacks of old papers. The edges were yellow and brittle. Some were newspapers, folded and faded. Others were hand-drawn maps. The maps showed outlines of the desert, with markings and circles in red ink. Some places were labeled with numbers or names. Others had only strange symbols, twisting shapes, arrows, and lines drawn again and again in the same way. There were also small notebooks. The covers were cracked and stained. Pages were filled with lines of notes, sketches, and more of the same red symbols. The writing was messy in places, like the hand had shaken while writing. Some pages were torn out. Some were water damaged, the ink running down the lines. But enough was still readable. Everything in the trunk seemed to belong to the same person. Someone had lived here for a long time. Someone who had studied the desert, marked places, and written things down. Some of the newspapers were in English. Others were not. A few clippings had headlines about desert storms missing people and strange sightings. No food, no water, no clothes. Just paper, maps, and signs that someone had tried to understand something. The red symbols appeared again and again on everything. They were drawn in the same shapes across multiple pages, as if they meant something the person had seen and could not forget. The crew looked around the room. The walls had marks too, not words, but faded lines where things had once been hung. Maybe shelves, maybe tools. Now, there was nothing left but wood, dust, and silence. Outside, the sun moved slowly across the sky. Inside, the light shifted to the cracks and gaps, painting long lines on the floor. The air was dry and still. The crew stood there, not speaking, just looking at the forgotten pieces of someone's life. They did not know who the family was. They did not know who had drawn the maps or written notes. But they knew one thing. Someone had lived there, far from anyone else. Someone who had watched the desert for a long time. And whatever they had seen, they had written down in red. Mason looked around and then noticed a narrow staircase in the back corner of the house. The steps looked weak, and parts of the railing had broken off. The wood was worn down and dark with age. No one had gone up there in years. Mason walked toward the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight. The others stayed below, watching. Dust fell from the edges of the steps as he climbed. The air changed slightly as he went higher. It felt warmer, but not in a natural way. It pressed against his skin, thick and still. There was no breeze, only heat and silence. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched out in front of him. The walls were close together, and the ceiling was lower. The light from a broken window let in just enough to see. Cracks ran along the walls. The wallpaper had peeled off in large sheets, revealing layers beneath. Strange lines were drawn there, childlike stick figures and circles that twisted into each other. The drawings looked rushed, uneven, but also repeated. Some shapes were scratched into the wall with something sharp. Others were drawn in what looked like faded red ink. Mason walked forward slowly. The wooden floor under him was weak and made deep creaking sounds. Some boards felt loose, and he had to watch where he stepped. The air smelled of old wood and dust. One side of the hallway had a mirror hanging at an angle. The glass was dirty and cracked. He stepped in front of it to look. His reflection stared back, but something was wrong. His face looked stretched, like the glass was bent. His eyes were too wide, and his mouth looked like it was moving when it wasn't. He blinked, but the reflection didn't blink at the same time. He stepped back. The image twisted and then returned to normal. The others at the bottom of the stairs didn't say anything. They were waiting. Mason turned away from the mirror and stepped into the nearest room. The door was gone, just an open frame. Inside, a clock sat on a shelf. Its hands moved, ticking slowly. But the back of the clock was open. There were no gears, no battery, nothing inside to make it work. Yet it ticked in a steady rhythm. It sounded clear in the quiet room. Next to the clock was a small music box. The top was dusty. A faded flower pattern was painted on the lid. Mason opened it. The tune it played was slow and eerie. The sound was soft but sharp, like it had been warped by time. The melody played fully, then stopped. But the sound echoed for a moment longer than it should have, as if the room held on to it. The walls in this room had more symbols. Some had been painted over several times. Others were scratched deep into the wood beneath the wallpaper. There were no pictures, no books, no signs of furniture. Just a music box, the clock, and the symbols. The floor creaked again as he stepped out and moved to the next room. The hallway seemed to grow darker. The window at the far end let in less light now. Dust floated in the air. It looked thicker than before, like it had been stirred by movement, even though nothing had moved. In the last room, the walls were covered with long, uneven lines. Some of the drawings showed figures standing in rows. Others were just circles, layered and overlapping, drawn so many times the wall was marked deep. There were no signs of normal life here. No bed, no clothes, no personal items. Only the marks. Mason felt a pressure in his chest. The air felt too thick to breathe normally. The silence was deeper now, like the house was holding its breath. He looked out the small window. The sand outside was still and smooth. But for a second, the surface looked like it shifted, like something moved just below it. Then it was gone. He turned back to the hallway. The mirror was still there, and again the reflection didn't feel right. He avoided looking at it. The drawings seemed to shift in the corners of his vision, though when he looked straight at them, they stayed still. He stepped carefully back toward the stairs. The wood groaned under each step. He didn't stop. The thick air stayed behind him as he went down. The others looked up when he reached the bottom. Their faces were quiet, serious. No one asked what he saw. No one needed to. The upstairs felt different from the rest of the house. It didn't just feel old. It felt touched by something that didn't belong in the desert or anywhere else. Something that watched, even when it could not be seen. The pressure in Mason's chest eased slightly as he reached the bottom of the stairs. The strange feeling from the upper floor stayed behind, but the weight of it still lingered in his body. The crew did not speak. Their eyes followed him as he moved past them and into another room. There was one space they hadn't checked yet, a small side room with a desk near a broken window. The door had long been off its hinges, resting against the wall. The floor creaked beneath their feet. The light from outside came in at an angle, lighting up the desk. Dust covered everything. The wood was dry and cracked. One of the drawers hung halfway open, broken. A dead insect lay inside. The rest of the desk was empty except for one thing, a leather-bound book. The cover was dark brown and rough to the touch. The edges were curled from the dry air. A thin strap had once held it shut, but it had snapped. The journal sat in the middle of the desk, as if someone had placed it there carefully. Mason stepped closer. He reached out slowly and opened it. The first few pages were filled with small, careful writing. The ink had faded but was still readable. The writer had dated each entry. They began almost 20 years ago. The name written at the top was Elias Whitaker. He had lived in this building. His writing was neat, calm, and focused. At first, Elias wrote about the weather. He recorded the temperature, wind speed, and air pressure. He wrote about the sand shifting, the dry winds, and how the light changed across the dunes. He noted how often it rained, which was rarely, and how fast the water dried. He drew simple sketches of the hills and paths that once existed. As the entries continued, the tone stayed steady. He mentioned experiments. He studied how the sand moved at night and how the stars seemed to shift above the flat horizon. His observations were careful and detailed. It was clear he was a man of science. But slowly, the entries changed. A few pages later, the writing looked different. The letters became less steady. The lines curved in strange ways. Words repeated more often. Elias wrote about strange sounds. Not wind or animals. He was sure of that. He heard whispers when he was alone. At first, he blamed the heat. Then he stopped blaming it. He began to draw in the journal. The same red symbols from the trunk appeared on the pages. The drawings were rough but clear. Circles within circles, lines crossing over each other, sharp edges that looked like they had meaning. He said they came to him in dreams. He said they burned in his mind when he closed his eyes. Elias wrote about standing at the window at night. He looked out across the desert and saw shapes in the distance. Not people, not animals. They stood still and never moved closer. But they were there, every night, watching. He tried to light fires outside to scare them off, but they did not react. He covered the windows, but he still felt them near. He started sleeping in different rooms. He tried to leave during the day, but found his way back. He said the desert changed when he walked through it. He could not find his tracks. He marked his path with stones, but the stones were gone when he turned around. Time felt slower, or faster. He wasn't sure anymore. The symbols became more frequent in the journal. Some pages had nothing but drawings. The ink was pressed deeper, as if he had drawn them with force. He said the drawings helped him think, but they also gave him headaches. He kept seeing the same shape, a circle broken by a line that bent inward. He said it meant something. He didn't know what. He mentioned hearing music. It played at night, soft and slow. He could never find where it came from. He pulled apart the walls looking for it. He broke open the ceiling in one room. Still it played. Always the same notes. Always at night. Toward the end of the journal, Elias's writing became frantic. The words lost their order. Some entries were just a few lines. Some repeated the same sentence again and again. He no longer talked about the weather. He stopped writing the date. He only wrote about shadows, watchers, and the need to finish something, though he never said what that was. The last few pages were marked by smudges, as if his hands had been shaking. The paper had tears and stains. He wrote that he was not alone, even during the day. He saw them near the house, behind the dunes, inside the mirrors. He did not sleep. He could not eat. The silence had become too loud. Then the pages stopped. The journal ended without a clear final thought. Just a page half filled with a large red symbol, drawn over and over until the paper tore through. Mason closed the journal slowly. He said nothing. The others looked at him, then at the desk, then at the floor. The room was quiet again. The sunlight had moved. Shadows filled the corners. The dust hung thick in the air. The journal lay closed on the desk. The name, Elias Whitaker, still marked the inside cover. His story had ended here, but no one knew how or why. Mason stepped back on the desk, and the rest of the crew turned their eyes to him. No one spoke. There was no need to. The last pages of the journal had said enough. They began to gather their things. The sun had started to lower in the sky. Long shadows stretched across the sand outside. The light through the windows turned orange and sharp. Dust floated in the beams like tiny sparks. The wind had picked up slightly. It whistled through the broken frames and loose boards. Mason gave one last look at the room. He took the journal. The others collected the old maps and a few pages from the trunk. Everything else they left where it was. No one wanted to carry more than they needed. They stepped back into the main room, boots crunching through the sand. The house felt tighter now, like the walls had moved closer. The air inside was hard to breathe. It was dry but heavy, like it pushed against their chests. A faint sound filled the space. It was soft and distant. Not wind, not footsteps. It came from the upper floor, where the mirror still hung. No one looked back. They walked toward the door. As they stepped outside, the brightness stung their eyes. The sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows over the dunes. The building behind them looked darker now. The cracked walls seemed deeper. The doorway stood open, but it no longer looked like a place. It looked like an opening into something else. They moved quickly across the sand, heading back toward the plain. The heat had faded, replaced by the cool edge of evening. The sky had turned from blue to gold. The wind carried thin lines of sand through the air, brushing their legs as they walked. Halfway to the plain, one of the crew members paused. He turned and looked back. His eyes locked on something near the house. A shape stood still beside the doorway, not moving, not walking, just there. It looked like a person, but there was no detail, no face, no clothes, just the shape of someone or something standing and watching. He blinked. The shape was still there. He told the others to look. They turned, but now the space was empty. Only the house stood there with the wind around it. The shadows had shifted. The doorway was dark. The sand rolled smooth in every direction. They kept walking. When they reached the plain, the silence remained. No one wanted to speak. They climbed aboard, one by one. Mason checked the fuel. Everything was ready. The engines came to life with a low roar. The wind pushed against the wings. The sun touched the horizon. As the plane lifted into the sky, the house grew smaller behind them. It stood alone in the dunes, untouched by time. From above, it looked like part of the desert again, just another shape in the sand. But they knew better. No one looked back a second time. The flight home was long and quiet. The engine hummed. The desert passed beneath them in waves. The sun set completely. Darkness followed, stretching out across the land. In the cabin, the journal sat on Mason's lap. Its pages were closed, but the words inside stayed in his mind. The last entry had warned of something that was coming. It had said that no preparation would be enough. It had ended with a line that stayed with him. It was never supposed to end like this. Mason watched the stars appear outside the window. The sky above the desert was wide and clear, but he didn't feel at peace. Something had changed in that house. Something had been waiting, and now they had seen it. Whether it followed them or stayed behind, they didn't know, but the feeling had not left. It was still with them. When the crew landed the next morning, the sun was already rising. The world looked normal again. Roads, people, noise. The desert was far behind them, but none of them felt relief. They walked across the tarmac with heavy steps. Mason carried the journal in his bag. He never let go of it. Later that day, they met in a quiet room at the back of the hangar. The air smelled like oil and metal. No one sat at the table. They stood in a loose circle. Tired eyes, pale faces. Still, no one said much. They all knew what they had seen. Mason opened his bag and placed the journal on the table. Its cover was scratched and dusty. The others stared at it, but did not move. Some wanted to report right away. Others were not sure. They talked in low voices, trying to understand what they had found. There were no clear answers. The house had no records. The maps showed nothing. The building did not exist in any file or system. And Elias Whitaker, no one could find a file on him either. It was as if the man had disappeared along with the place he wrote about. A few days passed. Word started to spread. Mason spoke to a few people he trusted, people in science, research, and government. He showed them the journal. Some listened. Others laughed. They called it desert madness. They said the heat must have played tricks on them. Old paper, broken buildings. Nothing strange at all. Just imagination. But some did believe. A few experts looked at the red symbols and asked quiet questions. One man said he had seen symbols like that once, carved into rock in a different desert. Another said the clock with no gears reminded him of a case from 20 years ago. But no one gave solid answers. No one knew what the drawings meant or why the journal's warnings felt so urgent. Mason was offered money for the journal. He said no. He kept it locked in a box in his home. At night, he sometimes took it out and read the last pages again. His hands would shake without him knowing. His heart would beat faster when he reached the final line. Some of the crew left their jobs. One moved to another state. One started drinking more and talking less. Another never flew again. They all stayed in touch, but the calls were short and rare. Mason stayed in his role, but he flew less. He took fewer risks. He avoided desert flights. The building became a story. People online wrote about it. A few blogs picked it up. Someone posted a blurry photo of the structure from the air, a small dot in the sand. Most said it was fake. Others claimed it was part of a military test zone. One user wrote a long theory about time warps. Another blamed aliens. Mason read the post, but he said nothing. In time, the story faded. Just another strange tale lost in the sea of stranger ones. But not for Mason. The memories stayed fresh. Some nights, he would wake up sweating. He dreamed of standing in the hallway upstairs, facing the mirror that didn't move the way it should. He saw the clock ticking with no power. He heard the tune of the music box. And always, the red symbols glowed in his mind. The worst dreams came when he saw the desert. Not from the air, but in his sleep. Endless sand. No horizon. The house half buried. And far in the distance, rows of faceless shapes standing still. watching, never moving, never speaking. Just there. Mason never went back to the desert. The others didn't either. The place had taken something from them. Time, peace belief. It had left behind fear and silence. Years later, someone knocked on Mason's door. A researcher from another country. He had heard about the story. He asked to see the journal. Mason gave him coffee and opened the box. The man studied the pages for hours. Then he stood and said nothing. He shook Mason's hand and left. No one heard from him again. Mason now lived a quiet life. The journal stayed hidden. The story stayed unspoken. But sometimes, when the wind blew in just the right way and the sand moved across the dry ground near his house, Mason would pause. He would feel the air grow still. He would think about the building, the desert, and the final words in Elias Whitaker's hand. It was never supposed to end like this. But it did. And whatever had begun out there was still waiting. Somewhere under the sand. Somewhere just beyond sight. Quiet. Watching. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for all your support.